There are moments in an actor's life when a role becomes more than a performance, when it becomes a wound, a mirror, a weight, carried long after the cameras stop rolling. For Gerard Butler, the world remembers him as the unbreakable warrior from 300, the man who roared through battle scenes with a body carved from exhaustion and discipline. But few people ever heard the truth, the one he kept tucked beneath armor and applause, the truth that would not rise to the surface until many years later. Because behind that legendary strength stood a man who had already endured a different kind of battle, one shaped by loss, by childhood fractures, by a mother he adored, and then lost far too soon. Fans saw a hero, but inside he was still learning how to breathe through old grief, how to run from memories that followed him into adulthood. And as Gerard Butler reached the later chapters of his life, something shifted. The facade cracked. The story he had protected for decades finally came forward, revealing the brutal cost of becoming a legend, and the heartbreaking truth behind the film that made him immortal. Long before Gerard Butler carried the weight of a mythic empire on his shoulders, he was a quiet boy growing up in Paisley, Scotland, born in 1969, with a tender heart and an unsteady map of the world. His childhood was stitched together with moments of joy and deep uncertainty, shaped most powerfully by the sudden distance that formed when his parents separated. That early fracture stayed with him, not as a sharp pain, but as a faint echo that followed him into every room, every ambition, every moment where he questioned his own worth. He spent much of his youth navigating the emotional gaps left behind by that separation, trying to become the version of himself he imagined others needed. He learned early how to be strong, how to appear fine, how to push his true feelings down so the world would not see the fear he carried beneath the surface. Even as he laughed, even as he found comfort in stories and performances, there was always a quiet boy inside him asking where he belonged, and why life felt like it was pulling him in two directions. As he grew older, he followed the path that seemed safest, the one paved with expectations rather than passion. He earned a place at the University of Glasgow, studying law with a seriousness that impressed his peers, even though his heart rarely settled in the world of statutes and procedure. He wanted to make his family proud, to quiet the insecurities that whispered he would never be enough, and so he pushed himself forward, discipline over desire, reason over instinct. After graduating, he stepped into the polished hallways of a legal career, working as a trainee lawyer with the kind of determination that only comes from someone who is constantly trying to outrun failure. He arrived early, left late, and lived in a fragile balance between ambition and exhaustion. Yet even then, somewhere behind his steady exterior, a different dream was stirring. He had always felt it, the way some people feel the shift of weather long before the clouds form. It was a pull towards something more expressive, something more vulnerable, something that allowed him to be seen instead of hidden. But he could not listen to that calling. Not yet, not while he was trying so hard to prove he could hold his life together. Then, 1 week before he was set to qualify as a lawyer, everything fell apart. The news came sharply. Without warning, he was being let go, fired. A single word that carried the weight of his greatest fear, the fear of failing so profoundly that he would disappoint everyone who believed in him. For a moment, he felt the world tilt. The life he had built so carefully cracked open, exposing all the insecurities he had spent years trying to silence. And yet, in that heartbreak, something unexpected happened. The collapse of his legal career did not destroy him. Instead, it forced him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. He had never belonged in that life. He had been living someone else's dream, chasing a version of himself that never felt real. The loss shattered him, but it also freed him, making space for the boy inside him, who had always longed for something different, something bold, something beautifully uncertain. This was the beginning of Gerard Butler's real story. The moment when heartbreak became transformation, and when a young man stripped of direction finally began to discover who he truly was. When Gerard Butler left Scotland for London at 25, It was not with the confidence of a young man certain of his destiny. It was with a heart still bruised from failure, carrying a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, life had saved something else for him. He arrived in the city with no roadmap, no safety net, and no real understanding of the industry he was stepping into. All he had was the belief that he needed to try, because the alternative was to spend the rest of his life wondering who he might have become. London in those early years was both exhilarating and unforgiving. He worked small jobs, auditioned relentlessly, and learned quickly how often rejection echoes louder than praise. Every casting call was a test, every silence a reminder of how late he had entered the game. Most actors his age already had credits, networks, momentum. Gerard had none of that. What he had was a quiet fire, one sparked the day he lost everything and chose to rebuild rather than retreat. His first breaks came slowly, almost imperceptibly. In the late 1990s, he landed roles that barely skimmed the surface of public attention, but meant everything to him. A brief appearance in Tomorrow Never Dies, a larger role in Dracula 2000. These were not the roles that defined him, but they were the roles that steadied him, the roles that told him he belonged here, even if he was still learning how to believe it. With each new part came a complicated mix of pride and fear. Pride because he was finally doing what he had always wanted. Fear because every success carried the quiet question, can I do this again? Will it be enough? He lived on the edge of uncertainty, pretending to be braver than he felt, holding his breath through every callback, every table read, every moment where he stood between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. Then came the films that changed the shape of his career, not with explosions or spectacle, but with emotion and vulnerability. Dear Frankie revealed a tenderness in him that audiences had not seen. It was a quiet story, built on heartbreak and connection, and Gerard carried it with a softness that surprised even him. For the first time, he felt the world see him not as a hopeful actor, but as a storyteller. And then came the Phantom of the Opera. It was the role that frightened him the most. The scale of it, the passion of it, the legacy of it. But it was also the role that lifted him into a new light. For a man who had once felt invisible, the idea of stepping onto a global stage was overwhelming. He threw himself into the work, training, learning, stretching beyond what he believed he was capable of. And when the film was released, something shifted. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in. Yet even as opportunities grew, the emotional cost lingered. Starting late meant he was always chasing, always trying to catch up, always feeling the weight of comparison. Behind the red carpets and rising fame, there was anxiety that hummed quietly beneath the surface, the kind of worry that comes from building a life on ground that once collapsed beneath your feet. But through every doubt, every fear, one truth began to surface. He had found the place where he belonged, not because it was easy, but because it demanded every piece of him. And for the first time, giving everything did not feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. When Gerard Butler was cast as King Leonidas in 300 in 2006, the world saw it as the moment he became a legend. But for Gerard, it was the moment he stepped into the most punishing chapter of his life. The role was larger than anything he had ever carried, a character carved from myth, strength, and defiance. And with it came an expectation that he would not just play a warrior, but become one. The pressure was unlike anything he had ever known. The transformation began months before filming, long before the cameras, costumes, and battle cries. Gerard entered a training regimen known as the 300 workout, a brutal routine designed to push the body past every natural limit. Day after day he subjected himself to extreme diets, endless repetitions, and workouts that left him shaking, drenched in sweat, and sometimes barely able to stand. It was a physical rebirth, but it came with a steep emotional cost. The process consumed his life, leaving little room for rest, connection, or anything that resembled normalcy. He trained until his muscles shook under the pressure, until exhaustion blurred the edges of every day, and yet he kept going. Not because he felt invincible, but because he feared what would happen if he failed. This role had the power to redefine his career, to erase the doubts that had followed him since the beginning. But that kind of transformation required sacrifice, and he gave everything: his time, his peace, his energy, his sense of self. Every early morning and late night carved deeper into him, shaping not just his body, but the resolve he carried within. When filming began, the physical demands intensified. Gerard performed many of his own stunts, pushing through battles staged with full force, shields clashing, bodies thrown, every movement requiring precision and strength. The work was exhilarating, but it was also punishing. He suffered excruciating injuries, some small, some severe, each one a reminder of how deeply he had committed himself to this world of warriors and sacrifice. Behind the scenes he iced bruises, stretched torn muscles, and fought through pain that followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Yet the world only saw the finished product, the chiseled body, the fierce stare, the roar of a king who refused to kneel. They saw glory, but they did not see the loneliness that wrapped itself around him when the set went quiet. The discipline required to maintain that physical shape left little room for comfort or companionship. Meals were calculated, sleep was sacrificed, and the pressure never eased. Praise poured in as the film took shape, but praise can feel strangely hollow when you are too exhausted to hear it. 300 became a global phenomenon, a film that turned Gerard Butler into a cultural icon. People admired the strength he portrayed, the intensity, the unbreakable spirit, but only he knew the toll it had taken to stand in that light. The role had demanded that he give more than he thought possible, and he did. But giving that much comes with consequences. Physical pain that lingered, emotional strain that deepened, and a quiet sense of isolation that success often hides. Still, Gerard stayed committed until the final shot was filmed. He walked away from the project knowing he had poured every ounce of himself into it, and in that truth, there was both pride and exhaustion. 300 changed his life, but it also revealed the heavy burden of becoming something the world expects you to be. And in the quiet moments after the applause, he confronted the truth that strength, even when displayed on the largest screen, often grows out of fear, sacrifice, and the loneliness no camera ever captures. In the years that followed, 300 Gerard Butler stepped into a new kind of spotlight, one that glowed brighter than anything he had ever imagined in his youth in Paisley. The world now saw him as a leading man, a hero, a figure carved from strength and certainty. Yet the truth of his journey, the part he rarely allowed the world to witness, was far softer and far more vulnerable. With each role, he carried a story that lived in the shadows of his success, a story shaped as much by pain as by triumph. He continued to build an extraordinary filmography, one that stretched across genres and touched audiences in ways that surprised even him. He brought a tender sincerity to P.S. I Love You, a film released after 300 that reminded viewers he was more than a warrior. He was a man capable of profound emotional depth. He carried the weight of action cinema in Olympus Has Fallen, proving again that he could embody resilience with an almost haunting conviction. And then there was How to Train Your Dragon, a film where his voice alone held the power to convey strength, fatherhood, vulnerability, and heart. These films solidified his place in the industry, yet each achievement carried an invisible cost that only he truly understood. That cost became painfully clear in 2011 while filming Chasing Mavericks. Gerard found himself fighting against a force far more powerful than any character he had played. A severe surfing accident pulled him underwater, trapping him in a moment that would stay with him long after the waves calmed. The ocean swallowed him again and again, dragging him across the water with a strength that left him gasping for life. When rescue finally came, it was not triumph he felt, but fragility, the kind that lingers in the quiet moments when the world is no longer watching. It was this near-fatal accident, that ultimately exposed the deeper wounds he had carried since 300. The stunt work, the training, the relentless physical expectations had chipped away at him slowly and quietly, until one day the pain was too much to ignore. By 2012, he entered rehab to address a dependence on pain medication, a dependence born not from indulgence, but from the injuries he had endured for the sake of his craft. It was an act of courage, one that required a different kind of strength, a strength that did not roar like Leonidas, but whispered like a man finally ready to heal. These were the parts of Gerard Butler the world did not see. The parts that lived behind the characters he brought to life. Fame had given him extraordinary opportunities, but it had also placed him in a position where breaking was easy, and admitting he was broken was much harder. Even as audiences celebrated him, he often found himself wrestling with the quiet truth that the roles which made him appear invincible were the very roles that had pushed him to the edge. Yet through all of this, something new emerged, something quieter, steadier, and far more human than the armor he wore on screen. He discovered that strength was not defined by how much one could endure, but by the grace to acknowledge the scars left behind. His success evolved into something deeper, less about proving himself and more about embracing the life he had fought so hard to build. In the end, Gerard Butler's journey became a reminder that the heroes we admire are rarely as unbreakable as they appear. Behind every moment of triumph lies a human story, tender and fragile, waiting to be understood. And for Gerard, that understanding became its own kind of redemption. The cameras stopped rolling, the applause faded, and the world saw a hero carved in sweat and muscle, a figure immortalized on screen. But behind the bronze sheen of King Leonidas, Gerard Butler carried a burden invisible to the fans who cheered. 300 was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, the moment that defined him in Hollywood, yet it became the role that quietly fractured him. Months of grueling training, the punishing 300 workout, and extreme diets had forged a warrior body, but the cost was more than physical. Every stunt, every leap, every orchestrated clash left marks that lingered long after the cameras stopped, and Butler began to feel the weight of a man expected to be indestructible. The injuries he endured on set were just the beginning. Chronic pain lingered for years, shaping the way he moved, the way he slept, the way he faced the world. In 2012, his rehabilitation for pain medication dependence revealed the deeper truth. It was not just his body that had suffered, it was his spirit. The world had praised him as a titan, but that image came at the expense of his quiet inner life, the moments when he felt vulnerable, fragile, and profoundly human. He admitted later that the film set standards he could never sustain, expectations that left him questioning his own identity, wondering if he would ever be the man he was before the armor of Leonidas. The emotional toll was relentless. Every interview, every public appearance carried a shadow of exhaustion, the strain of maintaining a heroic facade. Friends noted the intensity behind his eyes, the way the weight of the role lingered in his posture, in his voice, in his laughter. Audiences marveled at the strength, never knowing the fragility beneath it. Butler spoke openly only years later, revealing how aging had forced him to confront the consequences of that singular role, the way the triumph and the agony were intertwined. The truth, he said, was that 300 left him broken in ways that were invisible, silent and deeply personal. Yet within this revelation came clarity. Butler learned that the warrior image, the superhuman expectation, did not define the entirety of his life. He embraced the vulnerabilities he had once hidden, acknowledging the fear, the doubt, and the heartbreak that accompanied his rise. The story of 300 was no longer just about epic battles or box office triumphs. It was about resilience, about facing the aftermath of a role that demanded every ounce of his body and soul. The film that made him a global icon also forced him to reckon with what it truly meant to be human, to acknowledge the wounds that accompany greatness, and to accept the tenderness that comes with survival. Looking back now, Butler speaks with a warmth and gentleness that is rare in Hollywood, reflecting on the lessons of that chapter with humility. He no longer measures himself against the impossibility of a warrior's physique or the applause of millions. Instead, he honors the journey, the pain endured, the sacrifices made, and the emotional depth that the role extracted from him. 300 is celebrated for the strength it portrayed, but the real story is of a man who endured, who healed, and who finally told the truth about the invisible battles he fought behind the camera. It is the story of courage beyond spectacle, of humanity beyond heroism, and of a man who learned to confront both the glory and the heartbreak of the legend he became. The story of Gerard Butler is more than the battles of King Leonidas, the armor, the sweat, and the cinematic spectacle. It is the story of a man who gave everything to a role, who pushed his body and spirit to the edge, and who carried the invisible weight of pain and expectation long after the cameras stopped. 300 immortalized him as a hero, but it also revealed the quiet heartbreak, the loneliness, and the emotional cost that fame and physical devotion demanded. Yet in the revelation of that cost comes humanity, tenderness, and the courage to confront what was hidden for so long. Butler's journey teaches that strength is not measured solely in muscle or applause, but in vulnerability, endurance, and the ability to face one's own fragility with honesty. The true triumph is the man he became after the role, the man who survived, who healed, and who finally shared the emotional truth behind the legend. For more emotional stories, check out this video.